In the last episode, we finally saw the land united under none other than Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who in 1590 defeated the Hojo and pacified the north, bringing an end to the wars that had gripped Japan for over 100 years. With the land now under his rule, Hideyoshi's authority was absolute. Yet, as we saw, a lingering question began to arise within him. Doubts concerning the future of his family and the ability to keep the land at peace, along with a desire to turn the attention of Japan's veteran warrior class away from the country. This, coupled with his own genuine ambition, would lead Hideyoshi to fall upon an idea he had begun to formulate in years past: a grand invasion of the Asian mainland. A conquest which would hopefully secure a future for his family and peace at home in Japan. For a long time, people have been eagerly awaiting this series to reach this point in history, the outbreak of what would come to be known as the Imjin War, Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasion of the Asian mainland via the Korean peninsula. A war that would come to be remembered as one of the most significant East Asian conflicts and the first of its kind in this early modern era, one that would have lasting effects that have continued to echo through time to this very day. Now, there are plenty of ways I could go about discussing the war, making it a longer excursion from the Sengoku Jidai series, or rather an entirely new series all on its own. Yet, as I stated in my most recent Q&A, at this point in time, I do not have an interest in doing such things. In the context of this series, I view the Imjin War as a larger element that was key in determining the outcome of Japan's Warring States period. Because of this, I have come to the decision that at this time I will do probably 3 videos on the topic of the war, largely focusing on the samurai and how the conflict would come to impact Japan going forward. Keep in mind, this is a samurai history YouTube channel, and although I could delve more deeply into the Chinese or Korean perspective, I wish to instead shed light on the war as part of the overall narrative of the Sengoku Jidai. That doesn't mean that I will not at a later date revisit the war in more detail, but as of now it will only be told within the context of the period and not to a greater extent. On top of that, this decision was also made with the fact in mind that there are already plenty of other channels and series here on YouTube that have done a fantastic job going in depth throughout the conflict. Channels like that of author Samuel Hawley, or Japan at War, have great content that focuses heavily on the Imjin War, as well as Kings and Generals, which has also made amazing videos covering the conflict. Please seek out those channels and content if what I do does not quench your thirst enough for the Imjin War. But with that said, let us now rejoin Toyotomi Hideyoshi as he plans his ultimate invasion. By late 1591, after pacifying the land, Hideyoshi had been set to bring Japan into a new era of peace and stability. But it was one he could not guarantee would last, with the future of his family's authority in question and an uncertainty regarding whether or not after his death, Japan may slide back into another period of civil war. Many over the years have attributed Hideyoshi's invasion of the mainland to be one born of his great ambition. And although he would have surely framed it that way, and it is one of the most logical conclusions one could make for why he would invade, in this series, as you may have already seen, I have come to the conclusion to instead adopt another theory that has begun to circulate. That Hideyoshi's conquest of the Asian mainland, although perhaps initially born of ambition, was yet instead carried out due to fear. Fear of losing everything he had worked so hard to earn. Fear that his family may be toppled if he did not turn the samurai to a new target. As other historians have come to allude to, Hideyoshi's war in Korea was perhaps less about his own ambitions than we think, and much more about his own survival. As we saw in the previous episode, the plan to invade the mainland was not a foreign concept to Hideyoshi, as the idea of invading China had originally belonged to his predecessor, Oda Nobunaga, but had been passed down to him in the years following Nobunaga's death. And although for some time this idea may have been far-fetched, Now it appeared more and more like the most rational course of action, turning the attention of the daimyo and the samurai class as a whole away from Japan and onto a new conquest. We even saw how over the years of his reign thus far, he had taken careful and calculated steps to prepare for a potential assault on Korea, taking steps to not only build up the power of the Japanese navy, but also perhaps court Korea as well. If Hideyoshi could secure an ally out of Korea, it could lead to an overall swifter invasion of China, his real target. We saw how in 1587, he may have first reached out to Korea asking for safe passage through the country and into China, to which they did not reply. Again, in 1590, after his unification of Japan, Korean envoys are said to have actually made their way to Jurakude to congratulate Hideyoshi on his accomplishment. It is here we once again see Hideyoshi deliver a message to the Korean king Sonjo. His message takes an ambitious tone. Hot on the heels of pacifying the north and unifying the land, his confidence at this point would have been high. His message reads, "My objective is to enter China, to spread the customs of our people to the 400 or more provinces of that nation, and to establish there the government of our imperial city, even unto all ages. As your country has taken the lead and visited Japan, thus displaying difference, you need have no anxiety. On the day I enter China, I shall be leading my soldiers, and shall review my military headquarters. Then we shall renew our alliance. My wish is nothing other than that my name be known throughout the 3 countries." What is interesting to note here is that when he refers to the 3 countries, it has been said he was not referring to Japan, China, and Korea, but in actuality referring to Japan, China, and India. Once again, however, even with Hideyoshi's thinly veiled letter of intimidation and assurance, Korea disregarded it and gave no response. Thus, Hideyoshi tasked the Sole clan of Tsushima with continuing to plead with Korea for safe passage. Korea would never humor the idea. In fact, many within the Korean government never even fully believed Hideyoshi would ever invade. The entire concept just appeared too wild to comprehend, and even more so, probably believed Japan to be of little threat should they actually try an assault on the peninsula. We must keep in mind that the mainland opinion of Japan for many years had been that of piracy, being that the Japanese Wako pirates had continually raided China and Korea. They were unprepared for what Japan had become, following over 100 years of civil war that had hardened the island nation into a military powerhouse. After continually being ignored by Korea, by mid-1591, Hideyoshi realized he would not be able to count on them, and resumed plans to subjugate the country by force. This of course brings us back to the preparations he had been making. On the matter of the Japanese Navy, his grand fleet had grown substantially, yet it is important to recognize that much of it was not actually made up of newly built ships, but rather converted merchant vessels. When it came down to it, it appears the Japanese Navy was caught in an odd limbo. Japan had been exposed to superior Western-style warships and had tried to begin to implement design ideas from those ships into their own. Unfortunately, for their time, this came with some adverse effects. One large factor being the increased usage of iron nails, which easily rusted and weakened the integrity of the hull. There had also been another concept that had been typical to Japanese naval warfare that had never been thrown out. Instead of proper deck room for cannons, Japanese ships instead consisted of platforms for archers or gunners. This would greatly come to impact the range in which Japanese ships could engage at. On top of this, attempts to clamp down on Japan's rampant piracy problem led to a downfall of many with seafaring experience, leading to much of the actual sailors for his new navy having inadequate experience for the war ahead. In the end, it has been simply stated that although Hideyoshi saw the importance of possessing a large navy, he was woefully unprepared for a naval war of such magnitude, and did not fully grasp the importance it would come to play. Korea's navy, on the other hand, had become far more advanced after fighting Wako pirates continuously over the past decades. Many of their ships simply outclassed anything the Japanese could put forth, largely because they were armed with cannons, while the Japanese were not. But while at sea, Korea appeared intimidating. On land, the story was much different. In the previous video, we discussed how Japan by the year 1591 had become perhaps one of the strongest military powers in the entire world when it came to land warfare. A veteran force headed by elite samurai and matchlock armed foot soldiers equipped with some of the most advanced weaponry of the age, easily topping anything Korea or China could put forth in terms of ranged infantry. To make it worse, Korea at this point had really no standing army to speak of. Their military forces were made up instead of poorly equipped, unarmored, and outgunned peasant conscripts, and led by aristocrat generals with little to no military experience whatsoever. Indeed, what Japan lacked at sea was definitely made up for by their power on land. Following the breakdown of communication with Korea in 1591, Hideyoshi would gather his generals at Nagoya Castle in Hizen Province, not to be confused with the Nagoya Castle that would later be built in Owari. It would be here at Nagoya, a close position to Korea, where they would plan out their grand assault, and afterwards where Hideyoshi would continue to base his headquarters for the war. Being that Nagoya Castle in Hizen was located deep in western Japan, it was mostly western daimyo that were called forth. Figures such as Mori Teramoto, Chosokabe Motochika, Shimazu Yoshihiro, Nabeshima Naoshige, Kato Kiyomasa, and Konishi Yukinaga were some of the most prominent figures among others. In total, throughout the war to come, Japan would field roughly 500,000 troops, mostly made up of ashigaru, but also including samurai heavy cavalry. But it is very important, however, to note the role of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Over the years, we have seen how Ieyasu had become what at this point can be considered the second greatest power in the entire country, and the largest rival to Hideyoshi himself. Yet in terms of the war to come, Ieyasu's Kanto domain was far from the west. Thus, Ieyasu was able to negotiate his way almost out of the war entirely. Because of this, the only role he would come to play throughout the conflict is that he would be forced to make the journey to Nagoya Castle and remain there with Hideyoshi, who no doubt carefully watched him. That old distrust between the two of them had hardly gone away. But even displaced, Ieyasu had loyal and capable supporters back home who would continue to consolidate and run his domain in his absence. In retrospect, it would have been far more advantageous if Hideyoshi had been able to demand some larger form of involvement from the Tokugawa, something that could have worked to drain Ieyasu of manpower or wealth in the long run, thereby weakening him from ever posing a threat in the years to come. Had such a demand even been possible is another question entirely. Whatever the case, by the spring of 1592, the invasion was said to be fully prepared. The initial plan would be carried out by 9 divisions, comprised of many prominent samurai generals and daimyo. The plan was to commence as follows. The 1st Division under the command of Konishi Yukinaga would be the first to make landfall in the south, seizing Pusan and establishing a solid beachhead. He would then be joined by the 2nd Division under Kato Kiyomasa, who would begin pushing north. The final of the vanguard divisions would be the 3rd Division under Kuroda Nagamasa, who was to attack west of Pusan across the Naktong River. Following this, they would then be joined by the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th Divisions, while the 8th and 9th Divisions were to be used as immediate reserves and would be waiting on the islands of Tsushima and Iki. If all went according to plan, the overwhelming blitzkrieg of the Japanese army would drive up to seize Seoul and capitulate Korea in a short amount of time. On May the 23rd, Japanese forces of the 1st Division, who made their way from Kyushu up to the island of Tsushima, were now spotted off the coast of Korea. Chong-po, the commander of Pusan, was notified about the approaching Japanese fleet while he was out hunting. Immediately, he rushed back to the city and prepared the defenses. So Yoshitoshi of Tsushima would be the first Japanese commander to make landfall. He would issue one final ultimatum, demanding once again Japanese free passage through Korea to China. When they refused, Yoshitoshi began a siege of the city. The war had begun. This would be the first time since the Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281 that massive samurai armies would clash with an outside enemy, and the first time they had done so not on Japanese soil. In the ensuing assault on the city, both Japanese and Korean accounts of the battle glorify devastating casualties on each opposing side. Yet, after the Korean commander Chong-po was shot and killed, the city collapsed as Japanese forces pushed in. Meanwhile, Konishi Yukinaka had attacked the coastal fort of Tadejin, and after a vicious battle, Japanese forces took the fortification and butchered any survivors, in aims to show that resistance to Japanese occupation was futile. Not willing to allow Korean forces a chance to respond and form a defensive line, Konishi Yukinaka immediately pushed north to seize the fortress of Tongnei. It is here he issued a new plea to stand down and allow Japanese free passage to China, which was once again heroically refused. This would result in yet another hard-fought Japanese victory, which was followed up by another brutal massacre of survivors. Following the capture of Tongnei, the 2nd and 3rd Japanese divisions would make landfall in Korea. The beachhead had been established, and Korean resistance had been continually swept aside. With figures like Kato Kiyomasa, Nabeshima Naoshige, and Kuroda Nagamasa now all joining in the push north, things looked disastrous for Korea. All was going according to plan for Hideyoshi. So, what can we learn so far? By 1591, Toyotomi Hideyoshi was now dedicated to an attack on the Asian mainland, a conquest that was wrapped in not only his own ambition, but perhaps more largely in fear that his family and regime would eventually fall if Japan did not have a new conflict to invest itself in. After repeated failed attempts to court Korea into allowing Japanese forces free passage into China, he would gather his generals in Nagoya Castle in Hizen Province, where they would plan out the invasion that was to come. And although most of the generals called forth were ones based in western Japan, there would also be the addition of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would be kept in Nagoya while his army would be able to stay out of the fight. On May 23rd, Japan would make landfall in Korea, seizing Pusan, Tadejin, and pushing up to take Tongnei, all while sweeping aside Korean forces and massacring any survivors to call any chance at resistance. With this beachhead established, and with new waves of Japanese forces pouring in, the Imjin War had begun. In the next episode, the war continues as the Japanese onslaught pushes north and Korea fights desperately to hold them back. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.